George King III has an interesting story because while he was in reign, there were revolutions and wars, but this time I'm going to talk about his romantic side. King George III was known as Farmer George and Farmer King. He was a humble king and patriotic. He was the first king from the House of Hanover born in London. Well, the King of Great Britain was not always born in Great Britain. George I and II were from the Holy Roman Empire. Once George II passed, George III succeeded and became King of Great Britain. George III had few other women he wanted to marry, but rejected a few times from a few different ladies, and time was running out for George III because he became the king. The best candidate was selected as Sophia Charlotte zu Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The reason that she was selected as queen was because she would have less political influence and it can be safe for her not to get involved in any political conflicts. The wedding started within 6 hours as soon as Queen Charlotte arrived in England. It sure is faster than Las Vegas wedding style. Surprisingly, King George III made Queen Charlotte happy. George III never had other ladies. He was loyal to Charlotte, and he bought the palace for Queen Charlotte. And the palace that he bought was Buckingham. Buckingham Palace is now known for the palace where the king and queen live. But when George III bought the palace, it was where Charlotte stayed. So it was called Queen of House. There were 15 kids between George III and Charlotte, just between George III and Charlotte, which is an incredible amount of children from one person. The first son is Duke of Wales George, later becomes George IV, and the third son is William IV, the king after George IV, and the fourth son's daughter later became the Queen of Great Britain, Queen Victoria. I will talk about this story for later chapters, and I will continue with King George III's story. 15 children proves how happy their marriage was, but soon later sorrow slowly began in 1780. George III's mental illness got worse again. And in 1810, Princess Amelia passed, and King George III's mental illness got worse. Charlotte's heart tore apart by watching George III suffering between sorrow and mental illness. Later in 1817, Charlotte Princess, who is the granddaughter of George III and Queen Charlotte, passed, and later the Princess Charlotte's death caused some issues with succession in British monarch. Probably because the unbearable series of sorrow caused her to become weaker, Queen Charlotte passed in 1818 beside George IV, and once George III heard the news from George IV, he didn't understand what it meant because his mental illness destroyed him. And later in 1820, George III passed on January 29th, as age of 81. The cake that King George III gifted to Charlotte named based on her, Charlotte Royale. Look how delicious this cake looks. He must have loved his wife enough to come up with a cake like this. I need to call my lady. I'm going to look for Charlotte Royale to share with her. Anybody know where I can get it in Ontario, Canada?